Initially for this series, I want to take a closer look at a concept I discussed briefly in an earlier vid, that of what some scholars call corporate responsibility. This concept has direct bearing on passages like these, which might be understood by the poorly informed to blame all Judeans in Jerusalem for the death of Jesus. Of course, common sense by itself informs us that the Gospel accounts certainly do not indicate that every Judean alive at the time in Jerusalem was literally and actually in on Jesus' execution. Rather, they indicate that the only Judeans involved in Jesus' death were those who were supposed to be involved in the death of anyone charged with a capital crime. But what do passages like Acts 4:27 actually mean? In what sense do these passages make the people of Israel in this city responsible for the death of Jesus? The concept of corporate responsibility essentially means that in a given social setting, each person is charged with the duty to monitor and enforce the good behavior of everyone else. In our modern world, we have at best only remnants of this sort of thinking. For example, we consider it an evil for someone to refuse or neglect to call 911 when they see an accident, or fail to report a crime. What we see in the biblical world is on a much larger scale, and it's also present in the large majority of societies that have existed over history. Returning to the death of Jesus, we can now apply this understanding of corporate responsibility to the text of the New Testament, though we should actually begin with a completely different external witness. At around the time of the New Testament, a man we call Mara bar Serapion wrote a letter to someone. Although he was neither a Jew nor a Christian, he appears to modern readers to blame all Judeans for the death of Jesus, in the same way that the New Testament does. A hyper-literalist reading of this passage would lead modern readers to suppose that Mara meant that all Judeans, without exception, had killed Jesus. But notice he likewise blames Athens and Samos as a whole for the respective deaths of Socrates and Pythagoras. So the question becomes, are passages like these able to be seen as inspiration for later anti-Semitism? Did later church writers argue that Judeans, or Jews of their day, were embedded in the same corporate identity as Judeans of the first century? And just how far did this go in time and space? Is a Jewish person living in 1956 America embedded in the same group as that set of Judean persons who lived in the 1st century AD? To the extent that such a modern person too can be held responsible for the death of Jesus? Our answer is hinted at in the New Testament. Statements of collective responsibility made in evangelistic preaching in the New Testament are followed by a call for repentance. This amounts to an invitation to listeners to disembed themselves from the offending group, which would hardly be possible if the offense in question was one for which a person was literally and legally guilty. Notably, New Testament statements about Judean responsibility for the death of Jesus are made either about Judeans in Judea and Jerusalem. There is a notable lack of blame being pinned on Judeans in Rome, or in Smyrna, or in Corinth. This alone means that later attempts to pin blame for the death of Jesus on Judeans who were far removed in space and time from 1st century Judea are without New Testament justification. Nevertheless, as we'll see in upcoming vids, some of the arguments made by later Christian commentators did their best to embed the Judeans of their era into the same group as Jesus' governmental executors, by ascribing to the Judeans of their day traits they saw manifested in Judeans of Jesus' day.